I am Jadon Se, Golden Dragon of the Third Arc of Consciousness, and this is a message from the Dragon. Today's message, Recovered Histories, Part 5. Dear ones, where we left off in the earlier parts were beginnings and vibrational setup with Atlantis some 1 million years ago. Yes, dear ones, Lemuria was at its height of civilization, starting about 1 million years ago and reaching its zenith about 600,000 years ago. There were so many beautiful things in Lemuria. As your Atlantis was being set up, so to speak, the island, the small continent of Atlantis, and adjacent islands of this more temperate, forested, beautiful, mountainous island. It was being prepared, so to speak, for a coming civilization about 1 million years ago. This civilization had not yet appeared, and Lemuria was in full swing, dear ones. About the time of 800,000 years ago or so, in the height of Lemuria, the Lemurians were using beautiful natural technologies, you might call them, techniques for different things, their sources of abundance and energy and travel. They had beautiful crystal energy, energies that were harvesting beautiful energies from the sky, from the stars even, and using crystals, you might say, transforming these energies into more usable and more easily harnessed energies. This was using a crystalline grid that is still in place in parts of your world now, using the dragon lines, of course, and, dear ones, the Lemurians were very good at using these crystals for a resonance technology. It was beautiful. It allowed them to create amazing structures. Yes, dear ones, resonating energies was a form of levitation. They were able to use these technologies to lift very heavy, very large blocks and objects, to cut stone, to shape stone, to make it temporarily liquid. Yes, dear ones, many of the stones that you find in your South America that make your archaeologists scratch their heads as to how they could fit so perfectly together. They were loosely put on top of what wall was being built or what structure was being built, and using these resonance energies with crystals and resonating at the right frequencies, these rocks were temporarily made very malleable, very much like a clay, like a wet clay. And all they needed to do was place them lovingly above that which they wished to form it into, make it somewhat liquid with their resonance technology, and sculpt it as it was dripping down into place. Yes, dear ones, it was like using Play-Doh, a child using Play-Doh to build something that when it dried was as hard as the hardest stone on this your earth, and an enigma to these archaeologists that could not figure out how these joints were so perfect. They were perfect, dear ones, because the stone was temporarily liquefied, somewhat, very viscous liquid. There were not only these resonant technologies, there were different types of solar radiation were used and reflected to create lighting and electricity. They had a very clever system of reflecting light deep into tunnels and grand spaces, using mirrors and crystals and refraction to even bring different colored lights into different chambers and rooms. The Lemurians were very clever with their lighting, and lighting was always of utmost importance to them because they understood that proper lighting creates an environment of, let us say, vibratory resonance with the inhabitants. Beautiful red for certain purposes, and greens for healing, and etc. This is the the original source of what you may hear of now as the different rays, the rose ray, the emerald ray, the violet flame, etc. These were all their deep understanding of the way the effects of color on a being and on the light bodies of the being, the different aspects of beingness. Mm, there were deeply wise and beautifully engineered water systems in this your Lemuria. The water was encoded with beauty. Each water was treated as a living being. They named different waterways not for the name of the river or the waterway or the channel, but for the spirit of the water that dwelled there. They treated it as a conscious an entity in their experience in their life. Water became a deep and dear close friend. And the waters themselves had different properties. They were encoded, you might say. Some had a vibratory state where the water was the library of this village or dwelling, the library of the records of those who lived there and who had lived there in times past. It was easy to store and retrieve information from the various pools. And yes, dear ones, the water was used lovingly. It was, you would say, encoded with great life force energies. The water itself emitted a very beautiful, gentle light. When all lights were turned down for the night, the sources of water were like night lights everywhere. The underground spaces were lit so many times with water. This gentle, beautiful light that was just gently coming from the water and the ripples of the water and making the patterns of the water up upon the walls. It was very beautiful and artistic. And yes, dear ones, the Lemurians spoke to the waters. They sang to the waters. To this day, dear ones, you find beings who can sing to the water. And if you are very sensitive, you can notice that the water responds to their singing, that new energies appear when they do sing. This is beautiful and still very present in your world. Many Lemurians walk this world even now and remember deep, beautiful wisdoms from their lifetimes in your Lemuria, from their connected lives there. The Lemurians had beautiful light ships. They were able to travel through dimensions, and they were even able to travel to the stars. We touched on this before. Individuals learned how to make their Merkabas spin at such a high rate that they became orbs of light, and they were able to transport themselves. Yes, dear ones, even time travel. If Well, a golden dragon does not usually speak much of time. To me, it is just moving from one place to another because there is only one moment of now. However, to your understanding of time, this seems very dramatically different from the rest of your linear experiences, and you are able to skip around, so to speak, and jump timelines using Merkaba energies and these beautiful light orbs. And the light ships, there were living light ships, dear ones, bigger than whales. Several people could climb into these ships and go on journeys together. Some of the largest light ships were the size of small villages. Beautiful, beautiful soul technologies, spirit technologies. These were organic, life-based technologies. You did not find electronics and silicon technologies as the ones you have here. They were very different. Crystals were used, yes, but mostly it was consciousness that was creating their technologies. There were planetary energy networks that were created at this time, your grid works that are still in place, crystalline grids, communication networks, memory storage networks, libraries of information that span the size of continents, beautiful time capsules, so many different beautiful technologies at this time in Lemuria. We will leave off the Lemurian story now. At the height of this civilization, it was so beautiful that many of you so fondly remember the Lemuria of these days that you very easily are transported in your imagination, in your dreams, back to these times. And dear ones, yes, the flowers, the ever-present flowers and tropical plants and beauty. You can glimpse some of these on your Pacific Islands today. Dear ones, at this time, your Mount Shasta was also a capital city, you would say, of Lemuria. There were so many ships coming and going to the stars and from the stars through this, you might call it a starport. Yes, your Mount Shasta has been an interstellar and interdimensional hub, you might say, since these times, some 600,000 years ago. And, dear ones, it is still such to this day. Your Mount Shasta has a dimensional city named Telos, a city of light, you might say, that is still in full swing. The ships are still coming and going. They are just careful not to be detected by your third dimensional militaries, and even fourth dimensional appearances are, shall we say, a little hidden and obscured to prevent undue attention. Yes, dear ones, Lemuria is still here among us. We will not talk now about what happened to this great civilization of Lemuria and how it began to diminish over time. We will just say that you used to have a very different moon in your sky than the one you have now. And that moon, at the end of its time here with Gaia, it was broken apart on purpose, yes, dear ones, and crashed into many of the islands of your Lemuria. It changed the ocean basins as it fell to earth, and because the ocean basins are flexible, the new weight of these fragments of moon made your Pacific Ocean hundreds of feet deeper in many places, and many of the islands of Lemuria began to sink beneath the waves. It was a time where those who survived some of these tragedies, they just moved off into the continents and into the places above the turmoil that was hitting the Pacific Ocean. We will not go too far into this. We will shift now to your Atlantis. Some 200,000 years ago, after Lemuria was diminished, we will say, still in existence, but diminished quite a bit from its height, your Atlantis was founded. Yes, dear ones, the Sirians and the Lyrians and the Arcturians had been so lovingly preparing this your Atlantis for a coming civilization. They had created a beautiful crystalline grid there and many different ley lines that are of a different sort of grid work in preparation for a beautiful epoch of human history, your Atlantis. Some 200,000 years ago, many of the beautiful beings of Lemuria, survivors, you might say, from the times before, and new star being enhanced human beings that were 12-strand DNA, that were very much like your advanced Lemurians, but with a little extra love and tenderness from the Lyrians and the Sirians and the Arcturians. They were appearing on this your Atlantis, this small continent, and with the help of these star families and star beings, they very quickly became a civilization. They sort of skipped the indigenous aspect of this, although many of the Lemurians had come over, and some who had perished in Lemuria, they, you might say, appeared once again. This is not the same as what you consider to be reincarnation today. It was a little different, but we will not go too deeply into this. Basically, they were given the choice to return to Gaia, either in the remnants of Lemuria or in this new Atlantis. And many chose to come to Atlantis and bring the Lemurian wisdom with them. So you have many beings from the height of your Lemuria, bringing their knowledge and beauty with them. And we had these new civilizations popping up on your Atlantis subcontinent, you might call it, and they were very much guided by the star families of Lyra, Sirius, and Arcturus. The Pleiadians were somewhat involved as well, for they had great experience working with the humans here. And so there was this council that was very beautiful and lovingly guiding the beginnings of this your Atlantis some 200,000 years ago. And, dear ones, so many different rises and falls of this beautiful Atlantean civilization have occurred. You may have heard that there are golden ages and there are dark ages that are cyclical here on this your world, where Atlantis went through several of those. Approximately 8.5 of these entire cycles, so 8 golden ages and 8 dark ages occurred on this your Atlantis and indeed in the greater continental Gaia. There were outposts, you might say, of Atlantis in your India and in your Egypt. India was a beautiful meeting point of the remnants of Lemuria and the beginnings of Atlantis, and many beautiful civilizations flourished there. This was before your modern history. This is many tens of thousands of years ago, up to 110,000 years ago. Many beautiful civilizations coming and going. And yes, dear ones, there were floods. There were a series of floods. Atlantis did not finally sink beneath the waves until the greatest of many of these floods. Your world is not as stable as you think it is, and it takes a lot of stabilization from star beings and from, shall we say, intentional systems. Your moon is indeed artificial. This moon that you have now was brought from another star system about this time to stabilize after the second great flood, and the moon, the original Earth moon, the loss of this original moon was brought in. The original, you might call it a ship. It is a structure that began as an organic structure, but was engineered, you might say, created intentionally to come and stabilize the oceans of your world, and to help create the stabilization of the grids here. This happened some 185,000 years ago, and in the beginnings of your Atlantis, there were many perturbations of the oceans. Yes, dear ones, the system was being worked out, and it did take some time to finally settle into its current complex orbit. And there have always been those from the stars who have come periodically to keep things on track, so to speak, though the moon has been hijacked several times and used for nefarious purposes. But we will not go into that either. This is an overview, dear ones, of the timeline of the grand story of humanity here on your Gaia. I am just trying to make you understand that it goes back millions of years, and that star beings have had their hand in things here for the whole time. And yes, there were hands-off times where things were left to their own devices here, but that is another story for the future at some point. It is now your Atlantis at its high point. Some of the crystalline technologies from Lemuria were further developed. Yes, indeed, the crystals were made into beautiful technologies in your Atlantis. And these technologies were used not only for harnessing and focusing energies, not only for storing information and records, but also for focusing, you might say, what modern humans call magic. deep intentions, woven with the words and sigils. You would call them spells because intention, when it is paired with something that seems a little like poetry, gains so much more potency when it is brought out from the heart and mind in such a way that the poetry, the sigils, the spells focus through the crystalline technologies that were being developed. Yes, this is where you first heard of crystal balls. This is where you first heard of being able to gaze into a crystal ball and see clairvoyantly to different places, including other star systems. Mm, the crystals were used, along with the crystalline grid, to open up a great stargate, so that ships did not need to come and go as often. There was an open stargate in the capital of Atlantis for many thousands of years. Star beings would simply walk through the gate, and the Atlanteans would walk through to other star systems. Many times it was the Sirians. There was a very special relationship between the Atlanteans and the Sirians. And you see this to this day in your Egypt, for your Egypt is a later colony, you might say, of Atlantis. And the Sirian energies are very strong there. Yes, dear ones. You also notice many connections with Orion there, for Orion, before the corruption of many of the worlds of Orion, unfortunately, before the conflicts over there, Orion was one of the primary stargates of this area. Many beings from Andromeda were coming through the Orion stargate, and it was the most direct route into this, your Atlantis. And so you found many Orion connections and Sirian connections in the later parts of Atlantis. Indeed, even the height of Atlantis had a very strong Sirian influence. And, well, there are other tales to tell about the Arcturian energies that were brought to Atlantis, and of course the Lyran and Orma energies in your Atlantis. There was an epoch towards the end of Atlantis where the Lyran influence was, shall we say, dismissed from many things. Lions were removed from most of the edifices, most of the carvings and sculptures. The lion energies, there was a great effort to erase this from existence. Your Sphinx is part of this. You notice that the Sphinx, with its pharaonic head, was once a lion, and it once had a lion's head. These were removed. There were many different reasons for this. I will not go into what was happening in the greater cosmos, for the Lyrans and the Sirians were not always working in concert during this period. There was what you might call a conflict in amongst the Lyrans, and they had their own problems to solve, so to speak. And, well, they exited from having a heavy influence on your Atlantis towards the end of the epoch there. Yes, dear ones, during this period there were floods, there were calamities, there were times where humanity was very, we shall say, low vibrational, and there were golden ages, several of them. Yes, dear ones, you have been on this world for so long. You have had so many civilizations rise and fall. And, dear ones, at this time, towards the end of the height of Atlantis, some of the technologies that were being used caused, we shall say, great climate change on this world. And at first it was intentional, and then it got out of control. And there was an ice age that happened. It was more of a curse than an ice age. Gaia does need these cycles from time to time to cleanse and clear her ocean, so it is beautiful. There was nothing wrong with the ice age from her standpoint, but from a human standpoint it was a curse because the climate had gotten inhospitable and the oceans shrank, dear ones. It was very interesting. As the ice was building up on the polar ice caps, the oceans were getting shallower and shallower because they were all being tied up in these great ice caps. And because the oceans were shrinking, new islands were turning into small continents, and the shoreline was changing, and so humanity moved. Humanity developed along a shoreline that is now approximately 450 feet below the current ocean surface now. And during this period, this great ice age, many of your Atlantean remnants, because Atlantis was already on its outward bound trajectory, you might say. Many of the technologies that were being developed there were perverted by beings from another world. Yes, another of your planets, your Mars. The Martian beings, they came and they were not so very gentle about how they developed technologies. They threw the Lemurian wisdom of being close to Gaia out the window, so to speak. They became very arrogant and full of themselves. And yes, dear ones, towards the end of this your Atlantis, their arrogance grew so much that they had more faith in their own technologies than they did in the divine, if you can believe it. And when this happens, a civilization cannot stand for long. It just will not. It is like building a house of cards. It only takes one of their minor technologies to fail for the whole house to come down. And this is what happened at the end of your last ice age, what you might call your younger Dryas. There was a falling of Atlantis from grace. There was great corruption. There was arrogance and a lack of spirituality. The vibration of your average Atlantean became very low. And yes, dear ones, there was a calamity. The Atlantean scientists had tried to tap into a source of energy that was too potent for that time. They drilled deep beneath the surface of your Earth's mantle, and great forces were unleashed up in the northern hemisphere near your Alaska. And yes, dear ones, there was so much energy released by what was unleashed from your mantle that your polar ice caps began to melt so rapidly that great lakes formed on the ice, and then eventually a great wall of ice broke, and all at once so much water filled the basins of your oceans that the earth had another great reset. It was not as great as the reset at the beginning of these histories where a mega tsunami created the Andes Mountains, but it was enough of a reset for the oceans to rise some 450 feet in a very short amount of time. And this, dear ones, is your global flood myth. This message is getting long. This is enough for you to understand. This brings you about to your current biblical historical records. This is enough for an overview to know that human history is so much more grand than you know. And you may dip into the restored histories that are flowing back into the dragon lines and the grids of this earth right now due to your 3-eye Atlas Andronov object that is now restoring these memories. You may tap more into these on your own, but this is a dragon's overview of the grand story of humanity. It has been fun. I am Jadon Se, in love with the great and fantastic stories of humanity, and in love with this your Gaia.